In producing this video, I've used actual images of the events where I could. Where none were available, I've used those that I could find that best represent the way I remember things looked. In a previous video, I've recounted my father's life from his birth in 1908 in the Rhondda Valley until the time he returned from South Africa in 1934. Unfortunately, I'm not able to produce an equivalent history of my mother during her growing up years because I really don't know very much about that period of her life. I don't remember her telling me or my brother very much about it, and she left behind no written or audio record of it when she died in 1952. So I want to start this video of my growing up years by giving a brief account of what I do remember of my mother, since any account of my experiences as I grew up would be incomplete without some understanding of my mother's experiences when she grew up. Myrtle Idina Tudball was born in 1912 in the mining community of Hlunapia, on the opposite side of the Rhondda Valley from Triallo, where my father grew up. This is how it looks from above in 2007, all green and brown. But this is what it looked like at ground level 100 years earlier, all grey and black. The family lived at 14 Holyrood Terrace and consisted of the father, James Valentine Tudball, his wife, Mary Ireland, her mother, Edith Ireland, known to everybody as Granny Ireland, Mom, her 4 sisters, and 2 brothers. There were 3 small bedrooms upstairs, and downstairs consisted of 2 rooms, a parlour and the kitchen. The parlour contained all the best furnishings in the house and was off limits if you were in work or play clothes. The kitchen was the social centre of the house, as it was the only one that was heated. It was dominated by a huge cast-iron cooking range, a dining table, and a long leather couch. On Saturday nights, a large metal tub was brought in for bathing. The toilet was outside, across the alley and up a long flight of steps. The children attended a local school up until they were about age 14, at which time the boys would go work in the coal mines and the girls would go into service, which meant that they were employed as domestic servants in other people's houses. Mum was closest to her sister Edie, and they enjoyed roaming around the mountains together behind their house. As they grew older, there were dances and cultural events that drew them into a wider social circle. Dad had an uncle who lived at the first house on Holyrood Terrace, and he became aware of them just before he left for South Africa. He came to the door one morning where Mum was scrubbing the doorstep and said, "Hello." Mum recognized him and asked, "Do you want to see Edie?" To which he answered, "No, I want to see you." They talked, and he invited her to go to the pictures with him that night. Going to the pictures is the English phrase for going to the movies. She said yes, and a friendship was established that continued until he got back from South Africa some 5 years later. Mum first went to work as a kitchen maid on the estate of Sir Hugh Drummond, and I remember her telling me how when the fishing parties used to come in, she would take the trout and put them in the large kitchen sink and pour water in there until they started to revive and swim around. Mum's father, James Valentine Tudball, died in 1933 when Mum was 21 years old, leaving his wife to eke out a living and raise the children. The 2 boys were working down the mines, and the 4 daughters had all gone into service. Edie was in London, working as a maid in Charlie Chaplin's house, and she convinced Mom to transfer to London and work as a maid for a Jewish family, which she did for a while. And then when the Jewish family moved out of the country, she went to work for an American family. Dad returned home from South Africa in 1934, and after visiting his family in Wales, he went to London to find a job and to renew his friendship with Mum. They got married and moved to Slough, where Mum's sister Evelyn was living, and that's where I was born in 1935. I was born at 59 Warrington Avenue, Farnham Road, Slough. And you're forgiven for not knowing where Slough is. But if you'll look at the map, you'll see if you travel about 3 miles south of Slough, you come to Eton, most famous college in England. And if you continue on for another 2 miles further south, you're at Windsor Castle. Correct pronunciation. I was duly baptized and then whisked up to the Rhondda Valley to meet the rest of my relatives. The first stop was at Grandma Tudball's, where I met my Aunt Evelyn, my Uncle Roy, and my Aunt Edna. And then over the valley to the Thornells, where I met my Aunt Millie, who remained a maiden aunt all her life. I must have been a beautiful baby. I must have been a wonderful child. When I was only starting to go to kindergarten, I know I drove the little girls wild. And when it came to winning blue ribbons, I must have shown the other kids how. I could see the judge's eyes as they handed me the prize. I must have made the cutest bow. Oh, I must have been a beautiful baby, 'cause baby, look at me now. I don't remember when this picture was taken, but strangely I do remember the teddy bear and the red shoes and the beautiful ball. It was all crimson and gold and green and purple and blue and all metallic colors. It's probably because the ball stayed in the family for quite a while. 1936 was a significant year in England, since King George V died, and at his funeral all the crowned heads of Europe came to attend, and it was a magnificent affair. King George's son Edward became king, but he was in love with an American woman who had been divorced twice, and the British people refused to have her as his queen. So after a few months as king, he abdicated so that he could marry her. His younger brother was then crowned King George VI. We moved from Slough to Birmingham, which was the second largest city in England. Dad had got a job as a maintenance mechanic at a paper products manufacturing company in an industrial area that was developing on Cranmore Boulevard in the village of Shirley. So we rented a house there at number 124. About this same time, Dad's parents and his sister Millie left the Rhondda and moved in about 20 houses down the street. This is how the area looks like now. I've circled where 124 was. The diagonal line that goes through it is Cranmore Boulevard. Everything to the left of that line pretty much looks the same as when we lived there. Everything to the right of that line is different. All the factories have been torn down, and really a rather more pleasing looking industrial park now has taken its place. Even though life was peaceful in England for the next 2 years, Hitler was inflaming the German people with emotions that could only lead to war. But the British Prime Minister returned from his meeting with Hitler believing he had secured Hitler's promise of peace in our time. Well, I was too young to remember any of this, and I don't remember that in the middle of 1939 that Pete was born. I don't even remember World War II breaking out. Maybe that wasn't too unusual, because other than men being called up to go into the armed forces and factories converting over to making war materials, it didn't seem any different than peacetime. Germany didn't attack us and we didn't attack them for 9 months, and the period was subsequently called the Phony War. I started school around this time, and the first thing I can remember were the doors of this building. My mother had taken me there, and I don't know whether it was for registering for school or whether it was kindergarten or what it was. Don't remember how long I went there. I don't remember what I did in there. I just remember my mother bringing me up to those doors and me being scared to death. In 1940 I started going to an infant school right behind the parish church in the village of Shirley, and was about a 1.5 mile walk from my home. I went there for 2 years. One day in school we were asked to write a story. In those days the teachers called stories compositions. We had to write a composition about the war. She passed out the notebooks in which we had to write our compositions. And I remember at the time there was a popular song on the radio that started off, "Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition." So I said to her, "Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition, pass the books and do a composition." She thought that was very funny and told the other teachers, and they all laughed. And I remember feeling proud that day. You had to take your own lunch to school, and I remember mine was typically bread and jam and sometimes an apple. But after a while I noticed that some of the kids were receiving hard-boiled eggs at lunch. So I told my mom, "Hey, if you take a spoon to school, the teachers will give you a hard-boiled egg at lunch." Well, she thought you had to take an egg also so that they could cook it for you, and she was right. But shortly thereafter, Dad built a chicken coop at the end of the garden and got a couple of chickens, and from that point on we started having some eggs occasionally. Out behind the school there was some ground where we used to play in the dirt, but soon they dug slit trenches in there for us to take refuge in during raids. We did that several times, but down in the slit trench you could hear the airplanes and the bombs going off and the anti-aircraft guns, but you couldn't see anything, and we really felt cheated. One day workmen arrived and started tearing out the metal railings around the school, and we quickly learned about scrap metal drives. There were places set up at various points on streets where you could deposit any scrap metal, and schoolboys were especially urged to be on the lookout for old aluminum pots and pans, because they could be used to build Spitfires. Food was in short supply, and there were long lines for foodstuffs, so in January of 1940 the government implemented a system of food rationing. When you went to the grocery store to buy your groceries, you had to give him the coupons out of your ration book. And cut the coupons out and hand him the coupons as well as the purchase price. These were the rations for one person for 1 week. There were other foodstuffs too that you had to have points for, and the point allocation was 5 points per person per week. The government urged people to eat both less and more frugally, and to start their own vegetable gardens. School converted lawns to growing vegetables, and teams of children helped farmers with harvesting root crops. They also set up garbage cans for table scraps to feed pigs. Man, the smell from them on a hot summer's afternoon was overwhelming. Clothing was rationed, and it took almost a whole year's supply of coupons to be able to buy one man's suit. I learned to darn my own socks and to nail little metal plates on the heels of my shoes so they wouldn't run down so quickly. Mom turned our shirt collars so they would last longer. That is, she'd take the collar off, turn it inside out, and sew it back on again. She also turned the sheets. That was, when the center of the sheet got worn too thin, you'd cut the sheet in half, turn it around so that the outsides now became the middle, and sew it back up again. In fact, the working class philosophy was, fix it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. We had to put black paper screens or heavy curtains over all our windows at night, and there were air raid wardens on patrol outside who would issue you a fine if they saw any chink of light showing. So this is how I looked in the summer of 1940, when things started to take a dramatic turn. In early 1940, Germany invaded Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and France, and the British Army retreated to the beaches of France at Dunkirk, where they were rescued by small boats and ships and taken back to England. England looked defeated, and Germany looked unstoppable. But Churchill gave a series of speeches which restored the spirit and courage of the British people. They stirred my heart then as a little boy, and they still do now.
We are told that Herr Hitler had a plan for invading the British Isles. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. We shall defend our island, and with the British Empire around us, we shall fight on, unconquerable, until the curse of Hitler is lifted from the brows of men.
Hitler then sent his bombers and fighters to destroy the Royal Air Force and their airfields, and the RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes rose to meet them. For several weeks these aerial battles raged, and everyone was a spectator as the huge dogfights were often traced by the white contrails woven in the sky, and you could hear the sound of the gunfire and the scream of their engines. I witnessed one such dogfight as I was walking home from school one afternoon. I had to turn around and walk backwards to watch it, and I walked right into the back of a parked truck and banged my head. I thought I'd been hit by shrapnel. Churchill summed up the Battle of Britain with these immortal words:
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Hitler lost so many planes in these dogfights that he switched tactics to night bombing of cities to destroy the morale of the people. The big cities were hit hard, but Cranwell Boulevard got its share due to the factories there. This time was known as the Blitz and lasted 6 months.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
I don't know how many times we spent part of the night under the stairs during the bombing. It was winter, and it was no fun being pulled from a warm bed and stuffed under the unheated area under the stairs. When the sounds were far away, it was exciting. But when it was closer, it was scary, especially when the bombs landed close by. You could hear the sound and feel the concussion, but you couldn't see anything of what was happening out there. Every night during the Blitz, a mobile anti-aircraft gun would park itself on the corner about 25 yards away. During a raid, it would noisily blast away, and at dawn it would be gone. I would run out there each morning to see if there were any empty brass shell casings lying around, but there never were. Such casings are a hot item in the souvenir market amongst the kids. Shrapnel from the bombs was more plentiful and was readily found closer to where the bomb landed. I did find some out in the street, but the adults kept us away from the bombed-out houses themselves for a couple of days until the debris was cleared up a little. Playing in those bombed-out houses was great fun, but an adult always seemed to eventually show up. I never knew the people who lived in the houses around us that were destroyed. I heard about who had been killed or injured during the war, but no one that I knew personally was, so the real tragedy of war wasn't understood. It was all heroes and villains in action to a 5-year-old. Even during the peak of the bombing, I never felt afraid that our house would be hit. The bombs came on different nights, and I don't remember which was the first or which was the last. So I'll talk about the ones that were significant in no particular order. Significant means that it met the criteria, wow, that could have been us. On this particular night, my Uncle Derry was sleeping in the room with me in the other bed across the other side of the room. Derry was in the Air Force, and he was just staying over one night with us. This bomb landed about 50 yards away from our house, on the side of the house where my bedroom windows were. This one came without warning. No air raid siren had sounded, and so we were all fast asleep in our beds. Suddenly there was an intense flash which seemed to come straight through my eyelids, and an immediate intense roar of an explosion. I was stunned and confused, and then the flashlight was turned on my face, and I heard my father ask if I was all right. I sat up, and the beam of light swung over to Derry's bed. He was not there, and the blankets were all thrown about. There was a noise, and then we could see Uncle Derry crawling out from underneath the bed with a sheepish grin on his face. He told us after the war that that was the closest he ever came to any real action. 2 houses were destroyed and several people killed or injured. On one raid, a bomb hit a house about 100 yards down our street. In this photo, it hit right here. It blew down the front of the house, and the roof and the upstairs contents tumbled down like a landslide onto the front lawn. The bathtub was halfway down the rubble, and several of us little kids were joking about what if the woman who lived there had been taking a bath at the time. In a different raid, a bomb dropped very close to the previous one. It was not discovered until the morning after the raid, when they noticed a deep hole in the back garden about 2 feet wide. It was declared to be an unexploded bomb. News quickly spread around the neighborhood. A friend of mine told me about it, and we decided to go down and see if it was ticking. Fortunately, my mother realized what we were about to do and locked the garden gate, so we couldn't get out. At about the time it would have taken us to walk down there was a tremendous explosion, and we looked in that direction and saw smoke and earth thrown high into the air. I've always wondered whether our curiosity would have overcome whatever restrictions had been placed around the site. Several bombs hit the industrial area across the street, but only 2 come to mind. This one hit a large building that assembled detonators for bombs. Fortunately, it didn't set off any secondary explosions. There was talk that one of the factories in the area was a high-priority target for the bombers, and one factory got hit at least twice. We knew it as SU Carburetors, and only after the war did we learn that it produced the carburetors that were on the Spitfire. My final bomb story is remembered for the destruction it did not do. I heard that a bomb had hit a road over by Whitney Woods, so I walked over there and found that a large bomb had exploded right in the middle of a country lane. It completely closed off the lane, and the tall hedges on both sides didn't allow you to go around it. I thought that the Germans were going to be tough to beat if they could drop their bombs with that precision. On my way back home, my impressions of the German precision dropped considerably when I realized that they had missed their real target only a half-mile away and had accidentally hit a go-nowhere little country lane. After the war, when I was older and could roam farther afield, I stumbled upon a number of bomb craters tucked away in farmers' fields. Since most of the bombing was done at night, there were some things done to camouflage the targets. The walls of the buildings in the industrial area across the street were painted to look like the walls of our own row houses. I'm not sure we appreciated that. The other thing they did, we appreciated even less. They placed large smoke generators at intervals around potential targets. One was parked right outside our house. They were like big garbage cans with small chimneys on top and used or contaminated motor oil in them. When there was a clear night and a full moon, the fire wardens would set them on fire. Thick, black, oily smoke would be everywhere, making it difficult for the bombers to see their targets, but also difficult for us to find our way around. Sometimes the only way you could keep from getting lost was to keep one foot in the gutter and the other on the sidewalk. Frequently you would be shuffling along on the sidewalk and run head into someone doing the same thing in the opposite direction. The ensuing conversation would consist of, "Oh, sorry, where are we?" And occasionally, "Hey Fred, is that you?" For someone going home from the George and Dragon pub at closing time, it could get hazardous. Most of the bombing and destruction took place to the north of us in Birmingham. I occasionally got to see it when Dad would take me into the city on the bus. That destruction in Birmingham took place over several months, but the annihilation of Coventry, which was 10 miles east of us, happened in one night. There was not much you could do about the big bombs but head for shelter under the stairs. But everyone had buckets of sand ready to smother small incendiary bombs, and buckets of water and a pump to try to put out fires before they got too large. The government implemented a program in the heavily bombed areas of evacuating the children to foster homes in safer locations. Hundreds of children were sent to the USA and Canada, and my father considered sending Pete and I to his friends in South Africa, but finally shipped us off to Grandma Tudball's in Wales. Brothers were in the Air Force and her sisters were away from home, so we had Granny all to ourselves. I can remember walking along the terraces to the school nearby and feeling out of place, but not much else. In mid-1941, Hitler attacked Russia, and the mass bombing raids dropped off, although smaller raids did occur. Dad then thought it was safe enough to bring us back home. I was now old enough to attend St. James's Church of England school. It was in a much older building, just a block away from my previous one. At the start of the war, there was great fear that the Germans would use poison gas attacks, and so everyone was supplied with a gas mask. They were very uncomfortable for everyone to wear and frightening for little children. Sometimes the raids would come during the day while we were at school. The teachers would rush us into the air raid shelter.
Books away! Scramble!
Gas mask off! Now, we'll do our 9 times table. 1 9 is 9. 2 9s are 18.
Schoolwork tended to suffer on those days. One day I was playing in the back garden, and suddenly there was this great roar of aircraft engines overhead, and a large shadow flashed over me. I looked up to see the plane, but it was gone, and all I saw was a lot of leaves and twigs falling down on me from the tall tree at the end of the yard. I learned much later that it was a German Heinkel 111 bomber. It had been flying at treetop level, and that it crashed about 3 miles from our house. One of the defenses against low-flying planes were large gas-filled barrage balloons, and they were anchored by cables to the ground. The German planes would shoot them down in flames. I saw one burning and told my mother I thought maybe a bird had pecked it. Dad was called into the LDV, which stood for Local Defense Volunteers, but was more commonly referred to as the Look, Duck and Vanish. He was a fire warden who manned a lookout point over the industrial area and reported the location of any fires or explosions to the firefighters. He did this for about 2 or 3 nights a week in addition to his day job. Later on he was assigned to an anti-aircraft unit which manned a battery of ground-to-air rockets. He said they only fired once during the whole war, and it was an incredible sight. He joked that Hitler had cancelled the mass bombing night raids because his pilots freaked out at the sight of them. German submarines were sinking large numbers of merchant ships bringing supplies into England, and most of what did arrive was dedicated to the war effort. Gasoline was in such short supply that many buses and cars were converted to run on natural gas. The buses carried it in a trailer, behind the bus and smaller vehicles on big inflatable bags attached to the roof.
For the latest news on the Pacific situation, keep tuned to this station.
In December 1941, the Japanese struck the American fleet at Pearl Harbor.
Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked.
America declared war on Germany, and overnight the mood in England improved. The British Army defeated the Germans in the deserts of North Africa, and Churchill summed up the situation.
This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
It was the beginning of a number of changes in everyday life that I was aware of. I began to see American soldiers in the area and learned the phrase, "Got any gum, chum?" In the village of Hockley Heath, about 3 miles away, the large open ground was converted into a training base for gliders and the planes that pulled them. I joined the Cub Scouts and enjoyed it. One day at school, we were all given a package from America that we were told to take home to our parents. They were heavy, and a group of us decided to sit down and rest by a hedge on the way home. We opened up a package to see what was inside and found it was full of smaller packages. One of them was pre-sweetened hot chocolate mix. We didn't know what it was, but that package never reached home. All through 1943 till the middle of 1944, you could tell from the build-up of the soldiers and supplies that the Allies were getting ready to invade France. And on the 6th of June...
BBC Home Service. Here is a special bulletin read by John Snagg. D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European fortress.
From that moment on, I was glued to the news reports and followed the course of the fighting on my war map, all the way up until VE Day 11 months later, when Germany surrendered. The whole country celebrated exuberantly, from dancing in the streets in the big cities to each street having its own victory party for the kids out in the street. I won the egg and spoon race. I then followed the Pacific War on my war maps until all of a sudden it ended, quite dramatically. This has been how I saw my first 10 years. It came in those years from an awakening pair of ears and eyes and a growing brain to process it all. They're recorded here from a memory that has forgotten most of what it originally processed. What I do remember I can see with my mind's eye quite clearly, and such sounds as the air raid siren, the whistle of falling bombs, or the muffled sounds of gunfire and explosions awaken all sensations. The only material things I have are some old photos and 2 very special souvenirs that I've kept. A Nazi officer's ceremonial dagger and swastika armband. How did I get them? It was easy. I traded my roller skates for them to a kid down the street.